Kia ora tātou, no mai, haere mai, welcome to you all. Firstly, to our live audience here in the Otago University Media Production Studio, and secondly, to those of you streaming live online. I'm Dave Goosselink, and this is the Vote Chat broadcasting debate, sponsored by the Coalition for Better Broadcasting. Now, just a disclaimer first, I'm a moderator on behalf of the Coalition for Better Broadcasting. I'm not a member of the group, and views may not represent Coalition for Better Broadcasting. Now that we've got that out of the way, we have three panellists this afternoon for you, here to discuss the future of broadcasting in New Zealand, starting with Kris Faafoi. He's the spokesperson for broadcasting for the Labour Party. Welcome, Kris.
Good afternoon, Dave.
Secondly, we have Anne Genter. She's the spokesperson for broadcasting for the Green Party. Welcome to you, Anne.
Hi, Dave.
And third, we have MP Richard Prosser, representing New Zealand First this afternoon. Welcome to you, Richard.
Thanks very much.
Now, unfortunately, our current Broadcasting Minister, Craig Foss, was unavailable to take part in today's debate. However, in order to get a sense of National's broadcasting policy, we can begin with a snippet from his post-budget speech from earlier this year in May from Parliament TV.
I do note, Mr Speaker, just to talk quickly about my broadcasting portfolio, because I note the opposition spokesman spoke and actually didn't even mention broadcasting. I was quite surprised about that. A very good announcement today, Mr Speaker, where over 500,000 hours of New Zealand television archives will be transferred from Television New Zealand into MCH and DIA to be made accessible to New Zealanders online. That is National's ongoing commitment to public sector broadcasting, the preservation of what we have already and making accessible stuff that's already been paid for and is owned by the taxpayer. That is actually what a better public service is, Mr Speaker. We continue to allow Radio New Zealand and Television New Zealand to seize the opportunities in front of them in the challenging digital environment. The speech from the CEO of RNZ, Paul Thompson, the other day should be widely read by MPs in the House, particularly opposition spokespeople on broadcasting, because it shows the ability for our publicly owned public sector broadcasters to begin to adapt to this very challenging and new but exciting environment. Because where's Labour's position on this? This is what Labour, probably the Greens will be worse. Labour, Mr Speaker, want to control what you watch, when you watch, how you watch. That's what they do. They're stuck in the NZBC1 model, Mr Speaker. They talk about building a new channel, for goodness sake, when the entire world is moving away from traditional channels because it is about content. We should be blind to how it's delivered as long as it's produced and got out there and Kiwis can access it, Mr Chair. And how would Labour pay for this new channel? Well, they're putting a levy, apparently. They're putting a levy on ICT providers, i.e. internet companies. Internet providers in New Zealand will be taxed. Labour goes back to its natural position of it's moving, we should tax it. Let's ban Facebook as part of that and tax the internet within New Zealand to pay for the traditional mode of broadcasting to build this new Labour channel they're talking about. Absolute madness, Mr Speaker. Absolute madness. Labour are very much in a broadcasting NZBC time warp. National is digital, looking forward, working forward, future-proofed and looking to help New Zealand-owned organisations, government and otherwise, seize the opportunity to tell New Zealand stories across the world. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Now, that was Minister of Broadcasting Craig Foss explaining his idea for New Zealand broadcasting future. That's following Budget 2014. Now, in the spirit of future broadcasting, this debate is interactive through our online Twitter feed. Now, if you have any quick queries about what our panellists are discussing this afternoon or have questions you want to put to them, feel free to direct your questions to our Twitter handle. That's @OUVoteChat, or simply use the hashtag VoteChat14. That's @OUVoteChat or hashtag VoteChat14. We'll get your questions in a bit, but first we'll go to each of our panellists in order. I'd like to start this afternoon with Kris Faafoi. Kris, tell us your vision for public broadcasting under the Labour Party.
Well, before I get to that, because he's not here to defend himself, I'll have a crack at the Minister, actually, because of what he just said in your clip. No, he just said that National was about digital. They are the government that shut down TVNZ6 and TVNZ7. So that makes a lie of that. They say that they support Radio New Zealand. They have frozen the funding for Radio New Zealand for the last 5.5 years, to the point where the Chief Executive was in the Select Committee recently saying they can't cut anymore without fundamentally changing the way that RNZ operates. So I'm not going to sit here and watch 4 minutes of drivel from someone who can't be bothered to turn up to a broadcasting debate and think it's got any credibility, because they don't have any credibility on broadcasting at all. Okay, so in terms of the future, he's right about digital. That's where it's going under Labour, under any other future government. It's about what you want, where you want, and where you have it. But I think because of that, there's a whole lot of streams where you can get content. So I think more now than ever, it's really important that New Zealand content, and good New Zealand content, is available to everyone, and it's accessible free of charge. And that's where we're going to be heading.
Okay, so you're talking about the possibility of a funded public broadcaster, going back to that, and perhaps getting levies from internet service providers or
to deal with that last point, no. So you can square away that point with Mr. Foss as well. But we know it's public broadcasting is very important. We argued with many others that TVNZ7 should stay alive, but that government shut it down. So we're committed to public broadcasting. You're going to have to wait for a little bit longer to know exactly what our policy is, but we'll make sure that, in the age of sound and vision with the internet, that New Zealanders will have free-to-air, commercial-free, good quality public content there so everyone can enjoy it. So it's not just those people who can afford to pay for video on demand or for a Sky subscription can get good quality content.
How do you feel about the New Zealand on Air model, where New Zealand on Air is funding specific programs that are spread across all the broadcasters? Is that where you see public broadcasting?
I don't see any need to change massively what New Zealand on Air is doing. I think in terms of their funding, we'll keep that relatively stable. But also, I think we need to look at making sure that the types of content that we're looking at now isn't just broadcast. We're looking at a digital era now, and so we're going to have to slowly, with New Zealand on Air funding, and they're doing it to a degree, moving towards what we would call digital content.
So that pot, I think, is around about sort of $120, $130 million. Are you looking at increasing that pot?
We'll keep it stable, and we'll make sure there's enough money to do the things that we need to do, but you're going to have to wait for exact details.
Well, how would you fund if there was commercial-free? You'd mentioned commercial-free programming. How would you fund that without a levy?
We've got I'm not going to bore you with how we're going to raise other funds, but we're committed to public broadcasting, and we're not going to do what Mr. Foss said and look for a levy. We're going to make sure that there's money there because we're committed to public broadcasting. It's gone backwards in the last 6 years quite a lot, to the point where we had 2 TV stations. We've now got they are now dead. We've got our public radio broadcasters saying they can't cut any further. We know the importance of public broadcasting for nation building. So we need to make sure that those institutions, like TVNZ as it is now, and Radio New Zealand, are strong entities, because with media changing and shifting, those entities need to change and shift towards the new technology as well.
Now, you mentioned Radio New Zealand, obviously, as you say, has had funding frozen, but their chief executive has been talking more about digital. Obviously, they're looking at widening their audience. That would be no surprise to anyone that they struggle with the younger people, so they've launched the wireless to try and attract that. Radio New Zealand, has that got a digital future, or should it be radio?
I thought Paul Thompson's speech that he gave about a couple of months ago was a very good speech, and laid out some of the challenges that Radio New Zealand needs to face in a changing market. Radio New Zealand, his core work has been radio, but in terms of public broadcasting, they're the standout operators in terms of independence, and also making sure that there's good quality content there, and fact-based journalism as well, by the way. But they can't survive purely as a radio station alone. They're going to have to face the same challenges that other media do, whether it be Fairfax or APN. They can't be left behind.
Their funding freeze has been on for a while. Would you, Labour, be looking at increasing the amount of pot available to Radio New Zealand?
We'll make sure they've got enough money to do what they need to do.
Is that an increase?
But we'll make. I'm not going to give you exact details, but we'll make sure they've got enough money to do what they need to do.
So we've got to wait for that. How long? When is Labour likely to announce?
Give it a couple of weeks.
Okay. Do you think it would mesh with, obviously, coalition partners? Got the Greens and New Zealand First beside you in the chairs here. Is it a broadcasting policy that will work with what you understand other parties will be offering?
I've only had discussions with Julia in the past, so we're going to have to see afterwards, but I think it would.
Do you think New Zealanders support a fully funded public broadcaster? Are they happy with what they're getting? Do they want more online? Where do you think?
I think they would. I think they would support making sure that there's a properly resourced public broadcaster. We don't have one at the moment in terms of television. I think we need to make sure there's good quality independent journalism and content there, and I think in terms of what you've got with TVNZ at the moment, it's very commercially driven. I used to work there. You know, one of the reasons why I left was I thought that the marketing department was taking over what that news department was doing. So we need a public broadcaster that is there, fearless for journalism, fearless for standards, fearless for independence. Radio New Zealand is that at the moment. I'm not saying that's not there with TVNZ, but they're at the moment, under this national government, they're more about making money than being a public broadcaster.
Okay. Now we have got one question I understand on the Twitter feed for Kris. We'll go to that. This is from a studio audience question. The question is, why not levy private broadcasters, as they do in France, Ireland and Australia, to fund a decent public broadcasting system? Kris, is that something you've looked at, considered? Oh,
look, there was obviously a paper that was out there that was one of the options, but we've decided not to do that because we can raise the funds elsewhere. I guess, you know, hopefully that's an answer to the question. It was definitely an option that we looked at, but we decided not to do it.
Okay. And why was it decided not to go with that? Or I think ISPs was another one that was looked at?
Oh, look, basically because we thought we could raise some money ourselves.
Mm-hmm. There's enough money floating around?
That's right. Okay. You're going to have to wait for detail.
Okay, we've got to hang out for some of the nitty-gritty details. Talking about the spread of minorities, do you believe that New Zealand On Air should be looking, or public broadcasting should be focusing on programmes that don't make it to commercial TV, or should they also be mixing in, I'm thinking of the likes of the dramas and comedies and just, I guess, industry programmes rather than programmes which, you know, wouldn't be played on a non-commercial?
I think the digital environment offers the ability to do more in those areas. I'd like to see more done with the mainstream broadcasters because you've had, I guess, ghettoisation for quite a long time. But I think what you've got with CocoNet that New Zealand On Air rolled out, I think last year, in terms of the Pacific Island community, you have an ability to reach out in a completely different way, not a broadcast way, but a digital way to those communities who you want to get that content out to. So that's why I think, you know, as we shift from broadcast to being able to get content out in a digital way, you'll have a much better way to target those areas, and we have to start thinking about that kind of shift in funding and getting that content out as well.
Kris Faafoi, thank you for your points. We'll come back later and hear more with the panellists. We'll move on to our second panellist this afternoon. As we say, we're hearing more from the Labour Party in coming weeks, it sounds like, in terms of their full broadcasting policy. We move next to Anne Genter from the Green Party. Anne, does the Green Party have a fully formed broadcasting policy at the moment?
Yeah, we've had a broadcasting policy always, and we did go through a bit of a review of it in the last year, and I think it's been deferred now till after the election, the final review, just because we ran out of time. We had so many policies we were updating. But the Green Party has always been really committed to fully funded public broadcasting, and it's really concerning, I think, that New Zealand has one of the lowest levels of public funding for public broadcasting of any rich country, and we've got probably one of the most unregulated media environments as well. And ultimately, there's a really important role for public broadcasting to play in a democracy, because commercial imperatives just aren't going to deliver the sort of information that citizens need to make decisions about, you know, policies and politics. I think that's becoming increasingly obvious. And there's also another role in terms of serving those audiences who aren't target markets for advertisers. So particularly right now, I'm thinking, yes, the future is digital, and certainly I don't have a television at home. You know, when I access media, it's on my iPhone or on my laptop. And often I'm getting pointed to news stories and television stories through Twitter and Facebook. And that's the future. But there's a huge number of New Zealanders who don't have access to that, and particularly people who are older and who are stuck at home, and they're still, like, the way that they participate is watching television. And they aren't a group that buys lots of things. So there's really no content being produced for them. And I think that's a bit problematic. And it's a real shame that National killed TVNZ7 because it was hugely popular.
So how do you see the model as working? Would the Greens retain a New Zealand On Air type model, spreading programming across channels, or would you take that pot of money and put it into a standalone broadcaster?
Well, it's interesting to see where things are heading. I mean, I think that the truth is the NZ on-air model isn't really working for delivering high-quality public service content in the same way, because some of its funding criteria is having a broadcaster and having a certain audience. And so you really need a public broadcaster right now to be sure that the content's going to be carried. And like the public affairs shows get pushed off to Saturday and Sunday morning when nobody sees them. So I don't think it's perfect, and I think there's still a role, at least right now, certainly for an actual public broadcaster. And from there, you can go to alternative methods of delivery of the content. So like, for example, the BBC is obviously radio, television, and increasingly really excellent online content accessibility. So I don't see why you wouldn't want to start with a station itself, a broadcaster, that then is using other platforms for delivering its content.
So the Greens would be looking at another channel, or taking TV1, for example, and changing that?
Well, we'd like to see something like TVNZ 7 and TV6 back, right? And because that's really inexpensive. I think in an ideal world, we'd like to see commercial-free TV1. But the truth is that we're so far away from that now. We've got this state-owned broadcaster that is fully commercial, and it's unclear to me how we would move from how commercial it is now to something that's completely commercial-free. But I think it's worth investigating, because ultimately most people are watching TV1 News, and I think that there's a really important role for commercial-free news. I would
argue that they would.
TV3. Well, yeah, arguably TV3 is doing a better job than the state broadcaster.
It's a substantial amount of slightly younger.
But the competitive tension is such that it leads to sensationalized news, not information. And you can really see how extreme that gets in the United States, where pretty much the best journalism on television is actually being delivered by a comedy channel, The Daily Show on Comedy Central, and then the news shows, the proper news shows, look like parodies of themselves.
Okay. So just one question, picking up question. It's come through on the Twitter feed. It's come from the studio audience. Why not sell TVNZ, simply a commercial broadcaster, and use the money to create a decent BBC-style channel? Now, how expensive is that? Have you looked at the cost of doing something like that? Is that a viable option?
I have talked to people about the possibility of selling TV2 to make TV1 commercial-free, and I've been told that, look, TV2 by itself isn't going to fetch much. And if we sell TV1, I guess the question is, well, aren't most people still going to stay watching TV1? I mean, isn't that so? Yeah, I'm not sure if that's the best option. Even though we would love to have something like a BBC-style public broadcaster, and I think it's something worth working for.
You're talking about ratings. If TV1 did change to that, you're saying people would still watch TV1. Would they still watch it if the public affairs shows and things were on at 7:30, or would they still go and watch a channel that had a cop show, a cooking show, a home improvement show?
Well, it does seem like the research is that people are quite sticky, despite having remote controls and being able to watch things on demand. A lot of people just automatically turn on TV1 and will stay with it. And there's a certain brand power associated with it because it has been the state-owned television station. But yeah, the environment's changing pretty fast. So it is an interesting time to be thinking of new models for ensuring that we have that public service content and that we have methods of delivering it which ensure that citizens have easy access to it and that they're being exposed to it even if it's not necessarily as entertaining as what's on the commercial stations. Another
thing the Greens have talked about, or in their current policy anyway, is a quota for Kiwi content, 20% Kiwi content on TV and radio. Is that a voluntary, recommended kind of quota, or would that be a regulated quota that you're looking at?
Well, I think we'll start with voluntary, but obviously voluntary quotas don't get you anywhere usually because we've seen less and less local content over time, and so the whole purpose of the quota is to set like a bottom line so that playing field's level and ensure that there's a market for local Kiwi content, and I think that's really important, and it's good for New Zealand. You know, it ensures that we have a thriving screen industry here. And I think that's quite important.
Let's look at radio for the Greens, Radio New Zealand.
Immediate increase to Radio New Zealand's budget.
How much are we talking?
I think it needs at least 10% immediately. And it's not that much money. It's really not that much money.
Now, obviously, you're talking about the broadening of the digital environment and things. You're in favour of Radio New Zealand broadening its market, broadening the way it does things?
Absolutely, as long as it's not at the cost of its core journalistic responsibilities. I mean, you know, what it needs enough money to have the ability to do the investigative journalism, to put together good news reports and other content that it delivers. And then, you know, it probably needs some additional funding to be able to expand its ability to reach other markets.
Excellent. Thank you, Julianne. We'll hear more from you later in the programme as well. Thank you. Moving on to our final guest this afternoon, Richard Prosser, who's representing New Zealand First this afternoon. Richard, your thoughts and the New Zealand First policy on the future of public broadcasting, or broadcasting in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We were saying off air just before we got going that I didn't think we'd have, you know, too much that was different from Labour or the Greens in terms of broadcasting, and I haven't actually heard anything yet that we're opposed to. So, where we're going with broadcasting, with public broadcasting, is that there is a central important plank of that is the public service aspect, and that broadcasting exists for. Well, public broadcasting must exist for reasons other than simply to make money. It's there so that we can disseminate information. It's there so that it can provide, you know, a voice for the people. It's there so we can reach out to our neighbours in the Pacific. We need to have a system that's capable of providing comprehensive information in times of natural disaster, for example. The first thing that we're told to do in civil defence is, you know, reach for the radio. You'll be told what to do. If everything's commercially driven, we can't necessarily guarantee that that's going to happen. We were very much behind the Save TVNZ7 campaign, and that directive remains. We're not looking at changing that. We believe there is an absolute need for a commercial-free, state-owned channel, whether that's a resurrected TVNZ7 or a commercial-free TV1. I'm not sure, but the commitment is there for a non-commercial TV channel.
Now, you've talked about the possibility of combining, and this has been raised previously, combining TVNZ and Radio New Zealand resources. You know, Radio New Zealand have expressed interest in taking over some TV programming, Parliament TV, those sort of things.
What we've suggested is that we combine TVNZ and Radio New Zealand into New Zealand Broadcasting, and that provides immediate savings with back office work, the likes of administrative functions being combined together, bringing together a combined news operation as well, so that again you've got different mechanisms for getting out the same information, getting it out faster and out to more people. And we talked about, you know, we've discussed this digital age that we live in. And I have to say thank you for not inflicting the Minister's entire speech on us, because, you know, a few minutes of it was I mean, where is that guy coming from? But we can combine these things together, make a more efficient model, and that at the same time will help build a culture that's focused on service delivery as opposed to simply making money.
The idea of re-establishing a non-commercial channel, how much, what's the cost of doing something like that?
I don't know the exact cost, but there has to be an element in it of really, does it actually matter? If we decide as a country that we need to have a commercial-free public broadcast channel, then we pay what it costs to do that. And obviously we minimise those costs as much as possible, but not at the expense of sacrificing service. So
you're looking at something like a niche broadcaster, say like a TVNZ7 would be described as that, or as a mainstream taking over a TV1 and doing that kind of...
Yeah, again, we haven't actually finalised that. It's apart from making a commitment to the fact that there will be a publicly owned commercial-free broadcast channel. And I'm not sure whether those plans have gone any further than that.
What are you hearing from people in terms of public broadcasting? Do they see that as a vital need in New Zealand, that's something that's been lost?
Oh, look, I think it's something that's not central to people's everyday lives, apart from the fact that there's a bit of grumbling and people say, yes, we should have that. They're more worried, I think, about, in fairness, about things like jobs and housing and education and health and so forth. And when you have things like TVNZ7 being shut down, that's when it gets taken away, people notice that it was there. I think there's a general acceptance of, for example, Concert FM. You know, it doesn't make money. It'll never make money. It's not supposed to. It's something that we have as a nation to enhance part of the soul of the people, if you like. I mean, art galleries and museums and libraries and so forth don't make money either, but we still have them.
Now, I've heard from people that you know, Radio New Zealand in particular especially targets the older people, but younger people feel they let down a little bit by public broadcasting. Is there something that New Zealand First would look at for younger viewers, younger listeners?
I mean, I grew up listening to national radio, so that wasn't a factor in my life. But no, look, I think if there are particular young people things, then there's private broadcasting for that. It's covering it very well, and there'll be stages that people go through, phases of accessing, listening to different types of content.
Okay. Now I think we are going to a Twitter feed in my ear, but you can join our Twitter feed. If you want to join in the debate, you can tweet us at OU Vote Chat or hashtag VoteChat14. A question for Richard Prosser. How can you say broadcasting isn't important to New Zealanders on a daily basis? TV, radio?
No, I guess I'm going to qualify that and say it's not as important, so it's not as pressing as some of the other things. It's once you've taken care of the essentials, then you start looking at things like broadcasting. And again, the fact that once it's taken away, when it's not there, is when Joe Average tends to notice that it's problematic in the fact of not being there anymore.
So is a crucial part of, if you were negotiating, is it a crucial part of government, or was it something that can go in the like-to-have basket?
Broadcasting, I think, is something that governments tend to kick around, and it always gets tinkered with when there's a change of government. Broadcasting gets mucked about with, and generally we end up with something that wasn't as good as what we had before. So you need to have a commitment, I think, from whatever party or collection of parties form the next government to say, look, we're going to look at this seriously and actually provide something that is A, what the people want, and B, what's good for them as well, as opposed to just being somebody's sort of fanciful notion as to of what's going to make a better model, based really on nothing other than opinion.
What's your vision for a future for radio, for TV, and I guess the digital era?
Well, I think, the digital environment obviously has, as the others have said, gives us many more points of access for people, but at the same time, the airwaves aren't going away anytime soon. We've got nuclear-powered shipping at the moment, but we've also got sailboats still. We haven't. It's another medium by which you can put out the same content or a greater range of content, but it doesn't negate the need for regular broadcasting. Yeah.
Can we come to an issue for the whole panel, the issue of cultural programming? Now, Richard Prosser, the New Zealand First policy I've got here discusses improving Radio New Zealand specific broadcasting. I guess it also covers television and also Māori programming is done through Māori TV and Te Manga Pāho. Firstly, I'll start with Richard, since we're with you. What's your policy? Increasing? Is it being done well?
I don't think it's being done well enough, and the evidence of that is the fact that people are still grizzling about it. If we look at Māori and Pacific as being separate things, because I think they are, broadcasting to the Pacific is a twofold thing. One, it's a way of us getting our voice out there and letting them know that, hey, we're here and we're here and we're here to help. And the other thing is about obviously assisting with their cultural development and media in those countries. Māori broadcasting is something that's it's in a slightly different. We view it in a slightly different light because it's such a especially important thing to New Zealand itself. The special relationship Māori is always going to be there as a core of any service that's provided, and we have to make sure that it's funded properly and that it provides the service to Māori and to the rest of the country that it actually needs to, as opposed to, again, any small interest group.
Julianne, what was the Greens policy on that? Māori TV obviously is a standalone channel, but there is Māori programming filtered into some of the commercial channels. Pacific Broadcasting again, but as you would probably see, is on the edges and the off-peak hours.
We certainly have in our policy some reference to community radio and particularly community radio that's of importance to certain groups and certain cultural groups, and that would be Māori, Pacific, but also there are lots of other immigrant groups to New Zealand, and so continuing the support and probably increasing the support for that where it's possible, because it's not that expensive. I guess the critical thing is making sure that it's available and making sure that communities are aware of it and able to access it.
I guess cultural on like your Māori radio stations and Pacific stations are cheaper to do, but a TV station is more expensive. TV is more expensive, but Māori television is now our only thing even close to public service broadcasting on television, and I think they're doing an excellent job, even though that's not really their primary mandate. They do provide good content, and now that TV7's gone, I know a lot of people are watching Māori television a lot more. Probably not specific Pacific television station, but if we had
if we had increased support through something like the NZ On Air for content and ensuring that we had a public broadcaster who could broadcast it, then I think that would be a good solution.
Kris, Labour's views on that?
We in the past have wanted to commit to a Pacific television station, but that has had to go on the back burner, unfortunately, because they actually got rid of TVNZ 6 and TVNZ 7, which is the priority. We've got an aspirational goal to get that back into the policy. And as a Pacific Islander, I would also like to see that too, because that community is increasing in terms of the population. But I think Julianne made a really good point. We talk about Radio New Zealand and TVNZ 6 and 7. We actually forget that there's the ability for people at a very grassroots level, community level, with community access radio to be able to broadcast. And I don't want them to be forgotten about, because that's where a lot of entry-level broadcasting happens that can, suit those cultures and those other interest groups as well.
Now, there's a number of commercial operators in Auckland where there's a vast Asian population and they operate on a commercial basis. Is it not something that can be done on a commercial model?
Yes, but unfortunately I think the Pacific Island community and the Māori communities will struggle to do that on their own. As Richard said, we've got Māori TV, who I agree are doing an excellent job, but I think with the population change that we're going to see over the 20-25 years, especially that Pacific community will want to start seeing themselves on air a lot more as well. So hopefully if we can commit to making sure we can get a free-to-air public broadcaster happening in the next X number of years, we can look at that as well. I think technology and costs will change over time, which will make that easier as well.
Okay, thank you. We go to a question from our Twitter feed, and that's at OU VoteChat or hashtag VoteChat14. The public needs to be better informed regarding international and domestic affairs. How can the quality of current affairs broadcasting be lifted? I'll start in the middle this time. That's from T. Bishop. In the middle, Julianne, how can the quality of current affairs broadcasting in New Zealand on commercial broadcasters and on public service broadcasters be lifted?
Well, I think that having a good public broadcaster who had the ability to do that would then provide some competition and some incentive for commercial broadcasters to up their game. But at the moment, it's kind of a race to the bottom in terms of chasing ratings, because that's how we evaluate whether or not something is successful. And again, I don't think ratings are actually the most sophisticated tool for evaluating whether or not something is delivering good information on current affairs and international affairs. And so I think that's the nub of the whole issue around broadcasting. It's about how we measure success and how we define success. And if we're just defining it by this blunt tool, number of eyeballs, and not having any other criteria for assessing whether or not something is successful, then we're going to end up with television stations that are mainly showing reality programming, which, it's ironic, but I really don't think that's what people are looking for and what they need out of.
Richard, your thoughts? How can the quality of current affairs programming be lifted in New Zealand?
I actually think Julianne hit the nail on the head earlier when we were talking about sensationalism in American broadcasting particularly. That's probably the worst example of it, but we've got examples here that are nearly as bad. I think looking at international and domestic affairs, if we go back 30 and 40 years, and even if we look at perhaps the BBC model now, where the drive was really to provide the best quality of information as opposed to the most sensational information, and that's been something that because one starts doing it, the other starts doing it, and it's again about ratings. So if we have a policy that aims to encourage accurate, non-passionate, objective and informed news and current affairs, then and do that through a public funding model, I think people will start voting with their ears, and they'll come and follow those news feeds that are, something doesn't necessarily have to be a disaster all the time. Maybe sometimes it's just an accident. Maybe it's not shocking. Perhaps it's just disturbing. So if we tone it down a bit, get some intellect in behind the information that's being disseminated, then I think the commercial broadcasters will have to follow.
Kris, would you like to finish up this topic?
2 points. I think we need to stop treating viewers like idiots. I grew up in my young years watching Foreign Correspondent with my father. We need to go back. There is public good in good quality current affairs. And I think we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years the prime time current affairs slot move from information to infotainment. So there's a balance here because you've got to make sure that this thing can pay for itself. And good quality journalism costs money, but there's public good in that.
Excellent. Going back to our Twitter feed, again it's OU Vote, at OU Vote Chat or hashtag VoteChat14. Free-to-air sport broadcasting has been reduced in recent years. What would your party do to address this? I'll start with Kris this time. Free-to-air, you're looking at government funding rights for rugby and cricket and...
This is a really hard one because I think the horse is bolted. It's really, really expensive, and you know the people that have got the rights now are Sky. They've got a stranglehold on it, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars a year. And we have to weigh up whether or not we think there's public good in spending money on rights for sports. I think what we need to look at is, is there lower level sport that we can look at, and also are there some things that should definitely be on free to air. We do it with Rugby World Cups, obviously, and everyone holds hands and is okay with it around that time. But are there other things that should be free to as well? I think that horse is bolted, and it's far too expensive to be able to get those rights back without it having a flow-on effect with other organisations.
Julianne, do you think that the government should be funding, or should the government be sectioning off, saying these are the sports that we like as New Zealanders, we like rugby, netball, cricket, the rest can go on free to air, but you can't, you know.
Well, my understanding is that Sky has a real monopoly position and a real easy deal here in New Zealand, and that's part of the reason why they're able to monopolise all of the sport. And I think that we should be looking at regulating Sky because they're kind of an unchecked monopoly, and they don't actually bring a lot of value to New Zealand.
So you mean that the government would fund folks? Obviously, the sports the sports players these days, it's all professional environment, so they're funded from the broadcasting fees, which fund the salaries, which fund the clubs these days. Would the government step in and we give money to the America's Cup campaign, for example? Should they be funding the All Blacks?
Well, I'm wondering if it would be as expensive or if it would be as hard for the state broadcaster to compete for this stuff if Sky was regulated a little better. That's my understanding, is that Sky's got a monopoly position, and they use sport in particular to get lots of people signing up, and people are willing to pay $100 a month for Sky Television. Something like that. Is that right?
Close, you've got everything. I guess if you're adding, throw all your channels on. Yeah. Okay. Richard, for you, do you think the government funding sports or sectioning off certain sports, as many countries do have, as the nation's sports, and they have to go on a free-to-air broadcaster? Yeah,
I think something along those lines. I don't agree with Kris. I think the horse may have bolted, but that doesn't mean we can't get it back. I think sometimes the genie does have to go back in the bottle. And you look at you talk about the World Cup, okay, that's one thing. We get some free-to-air stuff on Mary TV, and I mean, I have to say about that, I was actually one of the people who was vehemently opposed to the establishment of Mary TV, but actually looking at now what they do and how well they do it, I'm very glad the country went down that road. When you talk about free-to-air, it's not necessarily commercial free, so there are still going to be funding streams. But look, I mean, the people paying for Sky TV and so forth, they're welcome to do that if they want, if they think it's value for money. We got an Igloo box just to get Kids Zone for the kids, and so I ended up with another 11 channels that I don't watch. Maybe National Geographic sometimes, but yes, I think there is a case that can be made for the nation saying, we the people, we the taxpayers, will stick some money into this aspect of broadcasting so that we can watch sport free on TV.
Now, Kris, one thing that's been brought up or raised in Labour's policy or comments you've made, Kiwis won't have to pay a monthly subscription to watch local and international content under Labour. Does that mean we're talking about New Zealand content, or is this, international?
Oh, look, I think as I've said before, we want to make sure there's good quality content out there from a public broadcaster, both sound and vision. And that's got to be free to everyone. We've got a commercial model which is imperfect at the moment. So if you want to go and watch content that you want, then you can pay for it. But what does that mean for everyone else? So that's why we think we need to have good quality international and local content as well, and no one should have to pay for it.
What's the definition of local and international content, quality international content? Are you talking, some would say Soho, Sky's pay-per-view, all the highbrow dramas, is that the sort of thing?
I don't want it to be any content for snobs. It's got to be good in terms of informing people, educating people and entertaining people. Those are the three things that good broadcasting should do. There's some local content that might be rubbish, but we want to make sure that there's good local content that is, that ticks all those three boxes. And also, as TVNZ shows, that it's quite possible bringing in good quality overseas content as well. There's some bloody good documentaries on TVNZ7 that we just don't see anymore.
Richard, going back to your younger days watching television, longer form documentaries are something that you don't see on television nowadays. If you see the current affairs shows, it's usually maybe 3 stories in an hour. Do you think that New Zealand viewers would still like to watch the old day style television?
I think they would, and I'm in probably a slightly different position, is that we never had TV when I was a kid. I was 10 or 11 before we got a television, and then we were limited to an hour a day. Apart from, I managed to... I must have been a budding politician even in those days, because I got an amendment snuck through that anything that was news or current affairs was exempt. So I watched anything that was newsy or current affairs just because it was TV and I was allowed to watch it. So I developed a real interest in those sort of things back then. And look, I think people are fascinated by in-depth stories, and you can pack a lot of content into 20 minutes or even 10 minutes if you're doing 3 stories in a half-hour show. So yes, I do think there is that demand lurking there, and all we've got to do is tickle it again.
For the Greens, Julianne, is quality content, are you just talking about current affairs, about news, documentaries, or does that also include a bit of entertainment, a bit of fun?
Yeah, we do. Our policy specifically references the importance of entertainment, that broadcasting is about entertainment, and entertainment is... can help a society define itself. It's about how we see ourselves. And so it's really important that we not only have funding for current affairs, I think that's incredibly important for democracy, but that we also have funding for local content, drama, children's programming, and comedy. Why not? Yeah.
Currently, I guess our high-end current affairs shows, if you like, in New Zealand, looking about a 15 minutes for a story. Is that long enough to cover a story?
I think that there are plenty of stories that could use more than 15 minutes, yeah, to be told. And particularly the stories that I try to tell as a politician, I find are very hard to squeeze into a soundbite. I probably need about 20 minutes. So, yeah, I guess maybe because I'm right on the edge of trying to explain complex ideas, in a policy environment where, the politics environment in New Zealand is such that the debate isn't really about policy, it's about the game, who's up, who's down, and you've got to be able to say everything in 10 or 20 seconds. That I'm particularly aware of the need for public broadcasting for current affairs.
Can we look next at trends, future trends, and picking up on international, how other countries are doing it? We've talked about the BBC and this, and obviously they've had huge restructuring, being forced to go a little bit more to their commercial side. In terms of New Zealand's, I guess, major trading partners, how do we compare? What ideas could we pick up? Kris, any ideas that you've seen around the world that, given the population difference, we could pick up on?
Oh, look, I think the BBC is a really good model, and we forget that they've got quite a large commercial arm as well. There'd be a lot of interest in the stories, the Kiwi stories that we can produce here, and sending that overseas, and I think potentially we're not making the most of that. But there's one other area that I think we could make a lot of commercial benefit out of, and we haven't spoken about it enough today, and that's kids' TV. We're talking about democracy and us as viewers, but if you look at what the kids have access to on television at the moment, it's usually overseas-based stuff with tons of commercials whacked in between it. So they're being, at that very early age, being exposed as consumers. Now, I've got young kids, I don't want that. I grew up in an era where we had great kids' Kiwi drama and all those kinds of things. We need to see more of that. And that will also support the industry in terms of making more New Zealand content. But I think the kids get left out here a lot, and especially under this government. If you want decent kids, New Zealand kids' TV at the moment, you have to pay for it to get Kids Zone. And that is content that is New Zealand made and is put together by TVNZ. Everyone should be able to have access to that.
Right. Julianne, children's television is a big part of the Greens policy, but already there is whole sections on commercial channels which have no ads for kids, especially in the mornings. They've got a whole range of it, probably they are international shows, but they're with no ads. Is that the way to do it?
Well, I think it'd be worth looking overseas to some other small countries who manage to fund public broadcasting to and they're the same size as New Zealand, so maybe countries like Denmark and Finland, and how they do it. And maybe they have a bit more of an incentive because they're also they don't have so much content coming from overseas in their language. But because we are English speaking, and when there's so many other English speaking countries, it seems like we've just forgotten about the unique New Zealand identity, and I do think that is shocking how little children's content is produced here in New Zealand, and I think that we'll start to lose our identity a bit. And I say this as an immigrant. You don't want your kids growing up speaking like me, but that's what's going to happen because all the content's coming from the United States.
Richard, are children, young people being missed out in broadcasting at the moment in terms of non-commercial? Or?
Yeah, in terms of non-commercial, I mean, like I said, we got the Igloo just for Kids Zone, and I think it's $5 a month or something, which is not a hell of a lot. But given the fact that it's all New Zealand content, or mostly New Zealand content on that, that should be more widely available, certainly. Talking about general funding, and because it is relevant, we talk about the BBC as well. We've got to remember that people still pay a TV licence in Britain, and that's a model I don't think New Zealanders would want to go back to. We like these things, but we don't like paying for them, which is fair enough. But one approach that we have that we think is a good idea to take to this is to simply, in order to make the money work better, simply reduce the amount of dividend that the state requires from the state-owned broadcasting sector. It doesn't need to run at a huge profit. If it covers its costs, that's fine. Even if it doesn't quite cover them, that's fine. That means that there's more money in that pot for making quality content.
Yeah, but it already doesn't return a very big dividend.
No. Well, I mean, this comes down to if you think there is
$1 million a year.
Well, if you think there's a public good in something, then that public good is funded. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a profit-making venture.
Kris or Julian, are either parties interested in a return to the broadcasting fee? It was abolished, I think, 1999 or so. Where you paid a licence if you owned a television. Is that era past where people, so many models and things, as I say, the phones, the tablets that were accessing content, is the model of a fee past?
You won't see it in our policy.
I think we have to have some means of raising revenue for public broadcasting, and it's got to be fair, and it's got to be sustainable, and it's got to be ring-fenced. Because it can't be competing with every hip operation every time, and every time there's a change in government, there's going to be incentive to cut back the funding for public broadcasting to spend it on other things. But if we agree that that's like saying we can't afford public broadcasting is saying we can't afford elections. I mean, if we want a proper democracy, we're going to have to fund this. So I think that maybe it's worth kicking it out to a citizens' assembly or something to investigate on ideas for how we raise the funding and to actually have a proper independent group consider it and come up with some ideas.
Now, you all heard earlier this afternoon Craig Foss's piece. I'm sure you probably heard it in Parliament the first time around. Kris, if National are re-elected this election, where do you see broadcasting going in the next 3 years?
Less funding. I think it doesn't suit them for there to be quality debate about issues that matter to Kiwis. That's why you've seen Radio New Zealand, squeeze the funding, TVNZ7, another place where debate, with depth happens, shut down. They quite like an 8-second soundbite, and they quite like being on the commercial radio stations because that's where they are. But we've got issues facing the country, and I acknowledge what Richard said, that are fundamental core issues which aren't being properly debated at the moment. And public broadcasting is a place where those debates can happen. We can, bring out talent, and we can get the information that we need. It's really, really important to make sure we have those debates.
Julianne, where would you see broadcasting going if it was another 3 years under a national-led government?
Yeah, same as Kris. I think that it's seriously under threat because it really doesn't suit their interests. And they've demonstrated that they're completely unwilling to increase funding for Radio New Zealand. They cut TVNZ7, even though it was very popular, even amongst their own voters. And so I would think that with a third term, they would be quite happy to destroy it even further so that it's, they have that advantage.
Richard, would New Zealand First consider going with a national government and moving broadcasting?
Look, I think if National are pulling most of the strings next time round, they've already flagged very clearly that they are driven by the dollar. This whole neocon disproven thing that they hang on to. There'll be lower funding for it. There'll be more commercialism. Anything that hasn't been sold off will be sold off. And I guess what they do, it's not going to be a priority for any government, I don't think, ahead of the things like jobs and houses and schools and hospitals, and those will be the things that they focus on first. But certainly the thrust of their broadcasting agenda will be to extract more money from it somehow. So I guess how much of that they are able to do depends on whether or not they can have handbrakes put on them.
Now, obviously, we've touched on this earlier, but the fact that we're having this debate that's being streamed on the internet rather than broadcast on a nationwide or local channel indicates that perhaps there isn't the willingness or the interest, Julianne, in, do you think? Is it willingness or interest?
Well, I think people would love it. Every time I go out and talk to a public meeting about something, they're always really interested in what I have to say, and they're always asking, why isn't this on television news? Why isn't this on the front page of the Herald? And I have to explain to them that, you know, the news is operating on a really short cycle. They only want to cover things that are happening right now, and so it's harder to tell a longer term story or a bigger picture story about how we could do things differently and smarter, you know, like with our transport system, for example. And that takes a little bit of time, but I've never found anyone who was not interested, and I think it would absolutely be possible to put more in-depth political debate on television. The problem is that it's competing with other things which can sell more advertising.
Kris, is prime time the place for these sort of programmes?
Oh, yeah, it is. But unfortunately, it's a commercial imperative that drives what's on there. And, you know, we need to have these debates. We need to have issues. We need to discuss housing. We need to discuss jobs. We need to discuss families and health. But you will only see that in the normal television debates. We need to have big debates about this, and it just isn't happening, and we need an outlet for that to happen.
Richard, do you think that, given the choice, would people watch the debate, or would they choose, police build houses and cook food? No,
I think they get into debate. It's something that stimulates people's thinking, and then they get involved in it. And I think this business of the digital age, yes, we're in it, but it's still not predominant. And I mean, I think the evidence of that is the fact that no one knows what's happening on Twitter unless the mainstream media tells you.
Excellent. We're going to back to our Twitter feed now. Another question. This comes from Jay Taylor. There's a severe lack of captioned content, both TV and online, for deaf people. And I think New Zealand Air's recent research came out, quite a significant number, I think over 10% do look at captioning. Is this included in your broadcasting policy? And I understand, obviously, it's not just deaf people, it's also, the research came out that a lot of people are using it for learning as a second language. I'll start with Richard there. Is captioning, an increase in captioning, important to that? Is that in your policy?
I think it's important. I don't know if it's in the policy or not, to be perfectly honest. I know there was an outcry when teletext was shut down. You couldn't get that anymore, and I'm not really certain why that happened.
Julianne?
It's definitely in our policy. Mojo Mathers, our disability spokesperson, is deaf, the first deaf MP in New Zealand, and she's been actually talking with different broadcasters about how they can increase captioning. But we would definitely want to fund that, and we think it's a priority. Accessibility, it should be accessible to everyone.
Kris, captioning, so just be on news, current affairs, or should someone wanting to watch, Mrs. Brown's Boys or CSI be able to have captioned show as well?
Look, I think most New Zealand content should be captioned. I think there's some huge number of people who are deaf or hearing impaired, something like 500 to 700,000, who could. That's a massive audience. So we need to make a commitment to them that we can do more. And I know that there are broadcasters, commercial broadcasters, who are looking to bring in technology to do more. And I think technology has helped it become much cheaper. In the past, it has been manual, which was obviously costly. But now with technology, I think it can be done much easier and obviously much cheaper.
Can I throw in one quick question just before we wind up? Regional television. I'm from a regional television background. The regional broadcasters around New Zealand. We've got Douglas Stevenson in the audience here, who also was on regional television, the local channel here in Dunedin. Regional television, is that important? Is that part of?
Absolutely, and I think the digital switchover has been disastrous for them. If you go around and speak to the regional broadcasters, they are really struggling because they simply haven't been supported post DSO. And there was a forum held in Wellington recently that hopefully they got the message through to the minister that they are not all one and the same. Some are commercial, some are community access, but they are struggling. And I think what's at the heart of it is transmission costs.
Julianne, regional broadcasters, I'm sure you've been interviewed by a few of those over the years?
Yes, I have, here in Dunedin, and I guess in Christchurch as well. Yeah, and I think regional television is really important, and that's where, with the lack of a commercial-free television station, I think regional television broadcasters were providing a lot of interesting content. And that was effective. It's not public service, but it's community driven. And just as Kris said, they've been hurting since the digital switchover, and we've got to find some solutions to ensure that they can continue having that ability.
Richard, I think the total pot for regional broadcasters across the country is less than 2 million, 1.6 maybe million for all the broadcasters. Is that an important part?
Oh, I think, look, it's insufficient, and Julianne's quite right. There's certainly demand for local content, and people want to know what's happening in their particular area. Whether there's enough of a population in New Zealand to warrant dedicated regional television stations in every area or not, or whether it's a case of having a nationwide channel which then has segments which are regional. Now you go to the regions and your region peels off. I think the news used to be done like that a number of years ago. That's something that could be looked at. Certainly there does need to be a solution to it, and getting the greatest amount of content for the dollars that are available has to be what drives that.
Cool. Just to finish up this afternoon, three panellists, if I can just ask each in turn a 30-second, if we can manage that, sum up. In an ideal world, if your party was in charge of the government, what would you see changing in the next 3 years in terms of broadcasting? Kris, we'll start with you.
Oh, look, ideally, I think you want to make sure that there's much more commitment to public broadcasting. There are plenty of commercial broadcasters out there, and they serve that market, but I think there's also, people are crying out for some good quality Kiwi content that's non-commercial, so we can have the debates, tell our stories, and make sure we can have good quality content for our kids. I think those things are very important, and it's certainly not there at the moment.
Julianne, under say, a Greens-led government, what would be your vision?
Well, ideally we would have a public broadcaster on television. We'd have publicly funded news that could be broadcast in a number of mediums, so that could be available on radio. We'd be increasing the funding to Radio New Zealand, but building on that, broadcast on television, or having an online portal which would facilitate access online, but also could probably draw upon some of our other public assets, whether they be archives or museums, in order to create content and ensure that that's even more accessible to people in New Zealand.
And Richard, finally, if New Zealand First had a strong influence on the next government, what is your vision?
Very much the same. I think the nuts and bolts are going to be driven by technology and public demand, but certainly there has to be a publicly owned and publicly funded, to a degree, broadcaster which is able to be the voice of the nation, which is able to provide good quality journalism that is professional, that is unbiased, that promotes for local content, and also within the environment allows for the commercial sector to provide for those other needs and make a profit where it can.
Excellent. Thank you very much to our three panellists this afternoon. Richard Prosser from New Zealand First, Anne Genter from the Green Party, Kris Faafoi from the Labour Party. Thanks for your time this afternoon. And thank you for our audience, both here live in the studio and out in the internet, for your questions this afternoon. Thank you. Of course, none of this would be possible without the help of Otago University's media and political departments, and of course the Coalition for Public Broadcasting. Thanks for your time this afternoon, and farewell. Ka kite.